Okay, let's go.
The birth of a small copper witness. In the cool, metallic heart of mid-20th century Canada, a country shifting between old traditions and new industrial rhythms, there existed a remarkable silence inside the walls of the Royal Canadian Mint in Ottawa. It was the year 1964, a year wrapped in its own peculiar blend of hope, change, and national pride. Workers walked through the wide mint halls with the steady confidence of routine, unaware that the coins they struck that year would one day become treasured relics of history, tiny storytellers carrying the weight of a nation's identity. The Canadian 1964 1-cent coin may seem humble, even ordinary, to someone who sees it today as just a small copper disc. But to those who understand coins, collectors, historians, numismatists, and dreamers, this penny is far from ordinary. It is a frozen moment of Canadian history, cast in bronze, minted with purpose, and distributed into millions of pockets across a land known for its forests, lakes, and quiet resilience. To tell the story of this coin, we must step back into the world that created it. A Canada still young in spirit, redefining itself under the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, whose portrait glowed proudly upon its surface. We enter a country where every cent mattered. Every coin rang with meaning, and every design on its reverse carried the voice of Canadian nature. The 1964 penny tells two stories at once, one of the monarch and one of the maple leaf, the symbol that whispers of Canada's vast wilderness. But more importantly, this coin tells the story of ordinary people, farmers who kept it in their overalls, children who saved it in jars, mothers who stretched it to feed families, young men who carried it during times of growth and uncertainty. A single penny multiplied into millions, circulated through lives that built the fabric of a nation. And so, before the world shifts too far ahead, let us slow down, breathe in the copper-scented air of 1964, and watch how this little coin came to be. The Mint awakens. On a brisk morning in early 1964, the Royal Canadian Mint began its daily ritual. The doors opened with a metallic sigh, and workers stepped into the warm hum of machinery. The minting presses, large, powerful, and precise, waited like mechanical beasts ready to be awakened. Inside the mint, copper sheets gleamed under bright industrial lights. These sheets, a mixture of 98% copper and trace amounts of tin and zinc, were destined to become pennies. The smell of metal was sharp but strangely comforting, the smell of thousands of coins yet to exist. A mint technician named Walter Hayes, who had been working at the Royal Canadian Mint for over 2 decades, walked between the machines with the familiar ease of someone who loved their craft. To him, the mint was more than a workplace. It was a living, breathing organism, a place where history was shaped not by ink or parchment, but by the strike of steel on metal. He placed his hand on the cold surface of the industrial press and smiled. Another year, he whispered to himself. Another penny for every Canadian pocket. This was no exaggeration. Pennies were still a vital part of daily life in 1964. Every loaf of bread, every newspaper, every handful of candy depended on the humble 1-cent coin. It was the smallest denomination, but it carried the greatest intimacy. Everyone touched pennies. Everyone needed them, designs that spoke of a nation. Before a single coin could be pressed, its design had to be perfected, and the 1964 1-cent coin carried one of the most beloved designs in Canadian history. On the obverse, the face of the coin, was the young portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, engraved by Mary Gillick, the British sculptor whose work became iconic across the Commonwealth. Gillick's portrait captured the Queen at the dawn of her reign, youthful, regal, serene. Her hair was tied with a laurel wreath, a classical symbol of honor, giving the coin a subtle elegance. But it was the reverse that held Canada's heart. 2 simple maple leaves attached to a small twig, a design created by G. Kruger Gray back in 1937. These leaves were not just artwork. They were a national identity pressed into metal. Each line of the veins, each curve of the leaf's edge, reflected a deep connection to the forests and wilderness Canada is known for. For decades, this maple leaf reverse appeared on Canadian scents, becoming as familiar to Canadians as their own flag. Children traced it with their thumbs. Shopkeepers recognized its outline even in dim light. Tourists carried it home as proof of their travels. By 1964, the maple leaf penny was practically woven into the Canadian soul. A coin in a changing world. Canada in 1964 was standing between two worlds. It was the age of expanding cities, modernization, and growing national confidence. The economy was strengthening, the population rising, and new industries emerging. It was an era where coins still mattered profoundly because they were the very tools of daily life. Yet, beneath that smooth progress, something else was happening, something no one at the time fully realized. Inflation had begun whispering at the edges of the economy. The value of a penny was slipping, slowly and silently. But in 1964, a penny still meant something. A child could buy a handful of bubble gum with just a few cents. Newspapers cost 10 to 15 cents. A single penny dropped into a child's piggy bank felt like real progress. And so, as the presses of the Royal Canadian Mint roared to life, the 1964 penny carried a quiet importance. It was both a tool of commerce and a companion of everyday life. It traveled through cities and towns, through farms and ports, through pockets and jars, witnessing the daily breath of a growing nation. The strike of history. The moment the press came alive was the moment history began its silent recording. As Walter adjusted the controls and the first sheets of copper were fed into the great steel jaws of the minting press, a deep mechanical thud echoed through the hall, a sound that was both violent and beautiful. It was the heartbeat of creation. Each strike slammed down with thousands of pounds of force, imprinting the Queen's portrait on one side and the iconic maple leaves on the other. Freshly struck, pennies spilled out in brilliant cascades, still warm from the pressure that shaped them. Their copper surfaces glowed like tiny suns, untouched by the world, pure and bright. Workers scooped them gently into bins, the clinking sound resembling rainfall against a metal roof. To them, these were just coins, millions of them, identical and predictable. But to time, to history, and to collectors decades later, each of these pennies would become a tiny relic, a survivor of a bygone Canada. Across the mint, inspectors examined sample coins under bright lamps. They looked for flaws, cracks, weak strikes, or misalignments. The 1964 penny had to be perfect because millions of eyes and countless pockets would encounter it. When a coin is used by nearly every citizen, even its smallest details matter. Somewhere in that pile of newly minted pennies, perhaps lying atop the heap or buried underneath 1,000 others, rested a coin that would one day be discovered by a collector, staring at it through a magnifying glass, wondering how many stories it had lived, how many hands it had passed through, how many miles it had traveled. But for now it was newborn. Copper stories of a growing nation. A penny may be small, but in 1964 Canada, it traveled far. Consider the first day of circulation. Wooden crates filled with rolls of fresh pennies were loaded into trucks, driven across snowy roads and frozen cities. The trucks rattled as they carried Canada's smallest currency across the province of Ontario, where banks awaited their delivery. At a bank in downtown Ottawa, a teller opened the crates and lifted a roll of brand new 1964 cents. The paper crackled as she peeled it open, and the copper coins inside sparkled with a shine that only brand new pennies possess, a shine that would last only a few days before life dulled its surface. These coins then began their journeys. One went into the pocket of a bus driver named Mr. Douglas, who dropped a penny into a metal donation box at the church on Sunday. Another was handed as change at a tiny bakery, where a young girl bought her first chocolate bar after saving her allowance for a week. A third penny found itself inside a farm worker's overalls, traveling from the wheat fields of Saskatchewan to the local hardware store. A fourth might have been lost between the cushions of a living room sofa. And a fifth, perhaps the rarest of them all, became a lucky charm in the pocket of a young man who carried it during job interviews, believing that its newness symbolized a new chance in life. Millions of pennies, millions of stories. But the story of 1964 doesn't stop at circulation. To truly understand this coin, we must step into the larger world that surrounded it, a world moving fast, yet quietly shaped by the tiny coins that passed through it every day. The world around the penny. 1964 was a fascinating year in Canadian history. The country was preparing for its upcoming centennial celebration in 1967. Patriotism was rising. Discussions about adopting a new Canadian flag were in full swing, a debate that would define national identity for generations. In fact, the maple leaf on a 1964 penny almost acted as a preview, a symbolic whisper of the modern Canadian flag that would soon be adopted. Canadians didn't know at the time, but the maple leaf was about to become the global emblem of their country. And so, the 1964 penny carried more than commerce. It carried symbolism. While coins were minted, debates echoed in Parliament. Should Canada adopt a single maple leaf flag? Should it move away from colonial imagery? Should it embrace a new identity? Every penny struck in 1964 carried the young Queen Elizabeth II on one side, representing tradition, and the maple leaves on the other, representing the future. It was a coin balanced between two eras. Life of a penny in Canadian hands. Imagine for a moment that we follow a single 1964 penny through its life. On a chilly winter morning, a woman named Margaret, wrapped in a wool coat and scarf, steps into a small general store in Toronto. She buys a box of matches, paying with a nickel, and receives 4 pennies as change. Among them lies a fresh 1964 cent, gleaming like a tiny copper star. She slips it into her purse without a thought. That evening, her young son, Peter, a curious 7-year-old, digs through her purse searching for gum. He finds a penny instead. Its shiny surface captures his imagination. He holds it close, examines the Queen's face, then flips it over to find the maple leaves. "Look, Mama," he beams. "Canada's leaf." His mother smiles. "Save it, Peter. It's brand new." Peter drops the penny into a small tin bank shaped like a red Canadian postbox. The penny clinks against other coins, each carrying its own history, but the 1964 cent feels different, newer, sharper, full of promise. In time, Peter grows up, leaves home, starts a family, and the tin bank is forgotten in an attic. Decades pass. The penny sits silently in the dark, its copper tones slowly mellowing, its shine fading but its story deepening. One day, an elderly Peter finds the tin bank while cleaning his mother's house after she passes away. He remembers the day he found that shiny penny as a child. And just like that, a single coin becomes a time capsule, not of national history, but of personal memory. And this is why coins matter. They don't just pass through hands, they pass through lives. A mint at its peak. To appreciate the 1964 penny, one must understand its scale. This was not a rare coin. It was minted in extraordinary numbers, over 484 million pieces, one of the highest mintages of Canadian cents in the decade. It was everywhere. Every cash register, every pocket, every piggy bank, every coat lining, every purse, every kitchen drawer. But even common coins have uncommon stories. Some 1964 pennies were struck more sharply than others. Some had slight variations in the die polishing. Some would escape damage and survive for collectors in brilliant, untouched condition. Others would become worn smooth, losing the fine details of the maple leaves after years of circulation. But all of them were witnesses to their era, silent observers of the human world around them. The quiet power of penny. A penny is a quiet thing. It makes no sound unless dropped. It holds no authority unless multiplied. It demands no attention unless missing. Yet in 1964, the Canadian penny was one of the most powerful symbols of everyday life. It was the smallest coin, yet the most personal. It was not like the larger denominations, the dime, the quarter, or the dollar, which people treated with caution. Pennies had no formality. They belonged to every hand, every pocket, every table, every street corner. The 1964 penny became a witness to millions of tiny transactions that stitched together the fabric of Canadian society. It passed through bustling supermarkets where shoppers pushed squeaky carts across tiled floors. It was dropped into library fines, parking meters, school lunch counters, and payphones. It lived in cash drawers that slammed shut hundreds of times a day. But above all, it lived in the small moments, moments that defined the character of a nation far more than grand historical events ever could. Pennies in childhood. For many Canadian children in the 1960s, pennies were treasures. They were rewards for chores, tiny victories earned for helping mothers hang laundry or sweeping the porch. Children would compete to see who had the shiniest penny or trade coins at school like tiny copper trading cards. On a sunny afternoon at Halifax, a group of friends, Tommy, Sarah, and little David, gathered near an old oak tree behind their school. They had a game they called penny toss. The rules were simple. Throw the penny toward the tree trunk, and the closest throw wins. That day, Tommy brought a brand new 1964 penny. It shone brightly in the sunlight, catching the attention of everyone. "Where'd you get that one?" Sarah asked. "My dad got it from the bank," Tommy said proudly. "It's brand new, never touched the ground." The others admired it with curiosity. For children, new coins were magical, cleaner, smoother, untouched by hands, dust, or time. Tommy hesitated before throwing it. He could keep it, save it, treasure it. But the excitement of the game won. He flicked his wrist, and the penny spun through the air, glinting like a firefly, before hitting the roots of the tree and settling in the grass. The children ran forward, shouting and laughing. That penny, once pristine, now had a small scratch across its surface. But it gained something more important, a story. The penny in workers' hands. Canada in 1964 was a land of labor. A fisherman hauling nets in the Atlantic, farmers working golden fields in the prairies, miners descending into the dark depths of Sudbury, and factory workers shaping steel, copper, and machinery. In these environments, pennies came and went like seasonal winds. Inside a lumber mill in British Columbia, a worker named Harold Thompson kept a small tin cup beside his workstation. Every day, when he bought his mid-shift coffee, whatever pennies he received as change went into that cup. He didn't save them intentionally. It was simply habit. By the end of the year, the cup was filled with hundreds of pennies, many of them from 1964. One cold December evening, Harold poured the pennies into his hands, the coins clinking like a metallic waterfall. He noticed the maple leaf design and traced it with his thumb. It reminded him of the red maple trees that turned brilliant shades of orange and crimson every autumn. For Harold, the penny wasn't just currency. It was a piece of Canada's identity, a reminder of home each time he spent it. Workers like Harold handled pennies every day. They bought lunches, bus tokens, cigarettes, and coffee with them. The penny was inseparable from the pulse of labor. A country preparing for change. While pennies circulated through everyday life, Canada was undergoing a quiet transformation. In 1964, Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson pushed for a new national flag, the maple leaf flag that Canadians know and love today. Before this, Canada used a design based on the British Red End sign, a symbol tied deeply to colonial history. Debates erupted across the country. Some Canadians clung to tradition. Others embraced modern identity. Newspapers buzzed with arguments for and against the new flag. In a way, the 1964 penny became an echo of this national debate. It carried the young Queen Elizabeth II, representing the Commonwealth, and the maple leaves, representing the future Canadian identity. Every time a Canadian looked at the reverse of the coin, they saw the maple leaf symbol that was rising to the center of national consciousness. The penny, though silent, became a subtle ambassador of change. A journey across provinces. If one could follow a single 1964 penny from one end of Canada to the other, it would reveal the vast diversity of the nation. That penny might begin in Ottawa, finding its way into a paycheck of a railway conductor. From there, it could travel to Montreal, clinking inside the cash register of a bustling cafe where French conversation fills the air. Later, it may be carried west by a truck driver stopping at roadside diners across the Trans-Canada Highway. As it moves further, it might land in Winnipeg, where it pays for a bus fare on a cold winter morning. Then south into the prairies of Saskatchewan, where it ends up in a small-town grocery store. It might travel further west to Calgary, where cowboys gather for the annual stampede. Eventually, it may reach Vancouver, where it finds its way into the pocket of a fisherman preparing to sail the Pacific waves. In each province, the penny witnesses unique landscapes: the Rocky Mountains, golden wheat fields, dense forests, crystal lakes, and vibrant cities, all connected by one small copper coin. A penny in hard times. Not all stories involving the 1964 penny were joyful. For some families, especially in rural or low-income areas, every cent mattered. The 1960s in Canada were stable years overall, but not every citizen shared in the economic growth. In a modest home in Manitoba, a widow named Eleanor counted her pennies carefully each week. She lived on a small pension and worked part-time, mending clothes for neighbors. Her grandson, Michael, would visit her on weekends and watch as she spread her coins across the table, sorting them into piles of nickels, dimes, quarters, and pennies. One day, she found a shiny 1964 penny among the worn ones. "Look at that, Michael," she said with a soft smile. "Brand new. Someone probably just got it from a bank." Michael picked it up and admired the maple leaves. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "Beauty doesn't always fade," Eleanor replied, "if you take good care of it." She placed the penny in a small jar labeled emergency fund. It was a humble gesture, but one made with hope, the belief that even the smallest coin could help carry someone through a difficult moment. The penny became a symbol of resilience. The hidden journey of a penny. Coins live secret lives. They slip into cracks between floorboards. They slide under car seats. They fall through holes in pockets. They hide behind furniture. They rest in dusty corners of drawers. The 1964 penny was no exception. A young couple in Montreal lost one during their move to a new apartment. It slipped beneath the baseboard and wouldn't be found until years later when renovations exposed it. A teacher in Nova Scotia kept one taped inside her desk drawer as a lucky charm. A mechanic in Alberta accidentally sealed one inside the engine of a car he would never see again. A fisherman in Newfoundland dropped one into the water, where it sank quietly into the harbor mud, destined never to be touched again. Each penny found its own path, some extraordinary, some ordinary, but all meaningful. The passage of time. Copper is honest. Unlike iron, it does not crumble. Unlike silver, it does not tarnish to black. Unlike gold, it does not shine forever. Copper ages gently. It deepens, softens, and gains a warm tone that collectors call patina. As the months and years passed, the fresh shine of the 1964 penny mellowed. Touch by touch, pocket by pocket, the coin grew wiser. Its edges softened. Its fields darkened. Its maple leaves smoothed with time. Coins are like people that way. They show their journeys on their surfaces. The 1964 penny bore the fingerprints of an entire generation. A legacy in copper. As the decades passed, the 1964 Canadian 1-cent coin continued its quiet journey through time. It passed through weddings and funerals, through crowded shops and quiet homes, through schools, banks, fairs, and train stations. It lived inside coat pockets during long winters and jingled in purses during warm Canadian summers. Through all of this, the world around it changed. Technology advanced. Prices rose. Canada transformed. Yet the penny remained the same. A simple copper coin holding the echoes of 1964. By the 1980s and 90s, the penny was still a part of daily life, but its value had begun to fade even more. Inflation slowly chipped away at its power, turning what once bought gum and candy into a coin people barely noticed. Pennies accumulated in jars, drawers, shoeboxes, glove compartments, and coffee cans. But even in its fading role, the 1964 penny refused to lose its dignity. It was no longer a coin of necessity. It was becoming a coin of memory. A coin is a time capsule. Each 1964 penny carried the story of a different person, a different place, a different emotion. Many Canadians kept pennies without knowing why. The same way people keep photos, letters, and small objects tied to moments they cannot let go of. In Vancouver, an elderly violinist named Amelia kept a 1964 penny inside her violin case. She believed it brought her luck during performances. She had found it on the floor of a concert hall in her youth, minutes before playing her first professional piece. She kept it in a tiny velvet pouch as a lucky charm for the rest of her life. In Calgary, a young father named Daniel taped a 1964 penny to the inside of his daughter's baby book. "Your grandparents used pennies like these every day," he wrote. "One day, they'll stop making them. Keep this little piece of our past." In the small town of Lunenburg, a fisherman kept a 1964 penny in his tackle box. He said it reminded him of his father, who passed away in the late 1960s. His father had once given him that penny to buy candy. Instead of spending it, he kept it and never let it go. Coins are strange things. They're not meant to hold emotion, yet somehow they do. Collectors enter the story. By the early 2000s, collectors began to pay closer attention to older Canadian cents. While the 1964 penny was not rare, its beautiful maple leaf design, combined with the increasing age of the coin, made it appealing to numismatists around the world. Collectors search for brilliant, uncirculated examples. Mint state, MS-65 and MS-66 coins. Pennies with strong, sharp maple leaf details. Coins with deep copper-red luster. Pennies struck from fresh dies. Variations in color, tone, or strike. A perfect 1964 penny, untouched since the day it left the mint, could shine as brightly as a freshly minted coin, a copper mirror reflecting history. Some collectors even kept full rolls of 1964 pennies unopened. These rolls, wrapped in brown or white mint paper, became miniature time capsules. Inside them lay pennies that never touched a human hand, never circled through the world, never lost their mint brilliance. Coin shops across Canada and the United States began receiving more questions about the 1964 cent. People wondered, is it worth anything? Is it rare? Should I keep it? While the coin was not scarce, collectors understood its true value was not just financial, it was historical. It represented the last years before Canada underwent dramatic economic and cultural transformation. It was a symbol of the maple leaf era before the penny slowly approached its end. The end of the penny era. On May 4, 2012, the Government of Canada announced something that many had suspected for years. The penny would be discontinued. Production stopped at the Royal Canadian Mint. New pennies were no longer created. Businesses began rounding prices to the nearest 5-cent increment. Canadians reacted with mixed emotions: nostalgia, practicality, curiosity. The penny that had once been the backbone of everyday commerce was now history. In 2013, pennies were officially withdrawn from circulation. Canadians turned in billions of them. Many were melted down. Many were forgotten. Many were stored in jars that would never be emptied. But the 1964 penny, already nearly 50 years old at this point, became something more than a coin. It became a survivor. It had lived through the golden age of Canadian copper coinage. It had traveled through the pockets of a generation that helped build modern Canada. It had seen the rise of the maple leaf as the central national symbol. It had stood through the end of its entire denomination. The penny was gone, but the 1964 penny remained as a relic of a world that no longer existed. A penny's echo, the meaning of 1964. What makes the 1964 penny so important? It is not rare. It is not expensive. It is not made of gold or silver. And yet, it represents the era of young Queen Elizabeth II, a time when her portrait symbolized stability and unity. The iconic maple leaf design, a symbol that became the heart of Canada's national identity. The daily life of ordinary Canadians. Children, workers, families, widows, farmers, teachers, all touched it. The transition of a nation, from traditional colonial imagery to a modern, independent identity. The end of a monetary era. The final decades before the penny vanished forever. The 1964 penny is meaningful not because of rarity, but because of its story. It is a storyteller, a copper narrator carrying the whispers of a country in transformation. A final journey from pocket to memory. Imagine the last moments of a particular 1964 penny's journey. After decades of circulation, it finds its way into the hands of a girl named Emma in 2013. She's 10 years old. The bank is giving out pennies to children as souvenirs on the final day they are accepted. She takes the penny home and places it on her desk. She looks at the maple leaves and the young queen's portrait. She asks her father, "Why did they stop making pennies?" Her father smiles gently. "Because the world changed." But that penny, that's a piece of Canada. A small piece, but a real one. Emma puts the penny into a tiny clear case and closes it. She doesn't know it yet, but she has become the guardian of its story. Decades later, she may show it to her own children or grandchildren, and the story continues. The 1964 Canadian penny, a nation in transition. Section A, the shifting winds of 1964. Canada, standing at a crossroads. Part 2, Section 900, 1,000 words. I will continue until full 3,500 words in later sections. The year 1964 swept into Canada, not as a quiet visitor, but as a spirited force, carrying with it the breezes of reevaluation, reinvention, and national introspection. It was a year in which old traditions and emerging identities collided, creating a season of transformation that touched everything, including the smallest coin in a Canadian's pocket, the humble 1-cent piece. Whereas Part 1 explored the foundations and origins behind this coin's existence, Part 2 begins with the world in which it circulated, the context that shaped not only its production, but the symbolic power it silently inherited. To walk through Canada in 1964, whether in the snowy streets of Montreal, the industrious avenues of Toronto, or the quiet towns of Saskatchewan, was to feel a country in motion. The post-war glow had faded into something steadier but more complex, a nation maturing into its own voice. Economic expansion was still present, but it no longer defined everything. Now, questions about culture, identity, language, unity, and international role were rising to the surface. And because money passes through every hand, the penny became an unexpected witness to this era's defining tensions. The political air was charged. Lester B. Pearson, Canada's Nobel Prize-winning Prime Minister, stood at the head of a minority government balancing delicate negotiations. His leadership in 1964 is remembered especially for a single heated debate, the new Canadian flag. The traditional red ensign, bearing a colonial echo through its Union Jack, faced opposition as Canada moved toward a modern, independent character. Debates rocked Parliament. Speeches boomed across the country. Newspapers printed clashing opinions. Families discussed it around dinner tables. Identity was no longer a quiet concept, but a public battleground. And while flags soared above the land, the penny clinked quietly below, small, unnoticed, yet a piece of this very same national story. Because every coin is, in its own way, a miniature flag. The obverse of the 1964 penny carried the effigy of Queen Elizabeth II, youthful, elegant, and unmistakably tied to Canada's British roots. The reverse, with a crossed maple twig design by G. Kruger Gray, represented something uniquely Canadian, independent of colonial symbols. The coexistence of these images reflected the very struggle Canada faced in 1964, a dual identity suspended between heritage and evolving nationhood. For many Canadians, the penny was the coin of everyday life, unassuming yet omnipresent. You might find a 1964 cent resting in the coat pocket of a railway worker in Alberta, earning a living in the booming industrial sector, or tucked into the purse of a mother in Quebec City, buying fresh bread before sending her children to school, or jingling in the trousers a university student in Halifax, debating politics in a cafe filled with cigarette smoke, jazz, and ideas that challenged the status quo. In these trivial transactions, the penny played a role, silently chronicling the collective mood of a nation undergoing change. The spotlight in 1964 also fell on the rising cultural divide between French and English Canada. Tensions were increasing, not yet erupting fully into the later crises of the 1970s, but clearly present. Commission reports, intellectual discussions, and student movements buzzed with questions. How could two founding cultures share one state? How should bilingualism shape institutions, currency, education, and governance? Even the penny's bilingual inscriptions, Elizabeth II DG Regina, and the maple leaves symbolism, reminded people that Canada's identity was built on layers rather than simplicity. Economically, 1964 was a moment of confidence, but also caution. The manufacturing sector was expanding, and new technologies were entering factories. Yet inflation concerns, debates about monetary stability, and discussions over national productivity were thick in the air. In such an atmosphere, the production of nearly around 484 million 1-cent coins was not merely routine, it was strategic. Pennies kept commerce smooth, accessible, and equitable during a time of shifting markets. And so the 1964 penny became deeply intertwined with this landscape. It circulated through a Canada that was renegotiating its entire place in the world, culturally, politically, and economically. Each coin minted that year held the freshness of newly struck copper, but also the invisible imprint of the country's evolving identity. Every time it exchanged hands, it carried with it the rhythm of a nation debating what it wanted to become. This is why Part 2 does not focus on the coin as an object alone, but as an artifact bound to the pulse of 1964. To understand the value of this penny, not its monetary worth, but its historical resonance, one must first feel the world it lived in. From Parliament Hill to small-town general stores, from the loud debates about flags to quiet reflections about belonging, the year shaped the penny, and the penny shaped the memories of those who used it. In the next sections of Part 2, we will venture deeper. The lives that touched the 1964 penny. If you wish to understand a coin, truly understand it, you must follow the hands that carried it. A penny, no matter how small, becomes a biography of the people who touched it, the streets it crossed, the pockets it warmed, and the stories it absorbed. The 1964 Canadian 1-cent coin was not simply a disc of bronze. It was a witness to millions of ordinary moments that together formed the heartbeat of a nation in transition. And in this section, we step not into museums or mints, but into the everyday Canadian life of 1964, where the penny lived its truest journey. Imagine, first, the hands of a railway worker named Thomas, living in Winnipeg. At dawn, he stood on the platform of the Canadian National Railway yard, his breath forming mist in the cold spring air. Thomas earned little, but every cent mattered. A single penny could still buy a small sweet for his daughter or serve as part of a modest lunch. The coins in his pocket rattled as he climbed onto a locomotive that smelled of steel and oil. Among them, a fresh 1964 cent, its copper still glowing, laid hidden but very much alive. Thomas would later use it at a small shop after his shift, sliding it across the counter, unaware that decades later, collectors would seek the same date with care and fascination. Then travel east to Montreal, where a young university student named Lucy sat at a wooden cafe table, surrounded by the hum of French debate and cigarette smoke curling lazily toward the ceiling. It was the time of intellectual movements, the early sparks of Quebec's cultural awakening, when discussions of identity, language, and autonomy filled lecture halls and street corners alike. Lucy carried a few pennies in her coat pocket, including a 1964 cent, which she dropped into a tin tray after buying a cup of strong black coffee. For her, the penny was trivial, but for the cafe owner, it was part of the daily rhythm that kept doors open and lights glowing. And yet, the penny did not belong only to workers and students. It also lived in the hands of new immigrants who arrived with hope and uncertainty. One such man, named Raj, had moved to Toronto from India in early 1964. His English was basic, but his determination was fluent. He worked long hours in a textile shop on Queen Street, learning the currency through touch rather than language. Pennies were the first Canadian coins he truly understood. Small, simple, familiar in size to those from home. The 1964 penny he picked up one afternoon felt like a symbol of a new beginning, a token of belonging in a country still finding its own identity. Every time he saved a penny, he saved a little of his new life. A different story unfolded in the quiet rural prairies, where 12-year-old Emily lived on her family's wheat farm near Regina. For her, pennies were treasures, shiny, curious objects that she collected in a small biscuit tin under her bed. When she found her first 1964 cent, she held it up to the window, watching the light shimmer across the maple leaves on the reverse. Emily loved the simplicity of the design, the elegance of the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, and the year 1964, which she etched in her memory as if it were a secret. She imagined one day having a full box of pennies from every year, a time capsule of her own country. In the bustling streets of Vancouver, meanwhile, a fisherman named Harold stood near the docks, counting change as he bought supplies for his boat. The Pacific wind tugged at his jacket as gulls screamed overhead. A 1964 penny slipped from his hands, clinking onto the wooden planks before rolling dangerously close to the water. He caught it just in time, laughing at the tiny object that nearly escaped him. For him, it was simply part of the daily transactions that made survival possible. Yet the penny, unaware of its narrow escape, continued its journey through hands hardened by the sea. Across Canada, millions of similar stories unfolded. The 1964 penny passed through schoolchildren buying notebooks, farmers purchasing seeds, mothers buying bread, soldiers returning home, and small-town shopkeepers who counted jars of coins each night before locking their doors. It was the coin of tips, of charity boxes, of church donations slipped quietly into envelopes. It was the coin children placed on railway tracks to flatten, the coin tossed into fountains with whispered wishes, the coin given to beggars by those who had only a little more. And among all these hands were the early coin collectors, the quiet observers who sensed, even in 1964, that this penny might one day become more than everyday change. A retired postal worker named Elaine, living in St. John, kept a small notebook where she recorded every new coin design she encountered. When she received her first 1964 penny from a grocery cashier, she noted its condition, the sharpness of the maple leaves, the clarity of the Queen's portrait. Without realizing it, she created the earliest seeds of what future collectors would cherish. Every penny tells a story, but the 1964 cent carried countless ones. It lived in pockets lined with wool, denim, and leather. It lay forgotten in drawers, dropped between car seats, buried under couch cushions, and tucked into jars that families saved for holidays. Each place it touched, each hand that held it, left behind an invisible fingerprint, a whisper of the life it witnessed. The beauty of the 1964 Canadian penny lies not only in its design or its mintage, but in the mosaic of humanity that carried it. It linked the laborer to the student, the newcomer to the lifelong resident, the child to the elder. In a year where Canada searched for unity and identity, the penny created a small but genuine thread connecting every walk of life. And as these stories weave together, the coin becomes more than currency. It becomes a symbol of shared experience, a reminder that nations are not defined solely by flags, parliaments, or speeches, but by the ordinary people who live their everyday lives, sometimes with a single penny in their pocket. Minting a symbol, how the 1964 penny reflected Canada's identity war. Standing in the Royal Canadian Mint in 1964, imagining it now, is like stepping into a world where metal becomes meaning. The smell of heat, copper, oil, machinery, and newly forged identity fills the air. But in that year, More than any other of the early 1960s, the act of minting a penny carried an invisible tension. For the debates outside those walls seeped into even the smallest decisions. What does a Canadian coin represent? What should it represent? And if a nation is changing, must its money change with it? This was the quiet pressure resting on a 1964 1-cent coin. Although the penny's design had been introduced decades earlier, the year 1964 placed it directly in the crosswinds of a political and cultural storm. Newspapers in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Edmonton, and Halifax were filled with heated discussions about national symbolism. The country was split between two visions. One Canada rooted in British heritage, another Canada stepping boldly into its own identity. And in the middle of this national argument stood the symbols Canadians saw every day, symbols like the portrait of the Queen on the obverse of every coin, including the penny. Inside Parliament, the flag debate had reached a breaking point. Prime Minister Pearson proposed a new design, one free of British emblems. Supporters saw it as a declaration of independence, a signal that Canada was mature and confident, able to stand without leaning on colonial symbols. Opponents viewed it as a needless abandonment of heritage. In a sense, Canada was not merely arguing about fabric and colors. It was debating the very essence of what it meant to be Canadian. And here, almost unnoticed, sat the humble penny. The 1964 1-cent coin bore the familiar maple twig design by G. Kruger Gray. Two crossed maple leaves, clean and elegant. The maple leaf, long before the flag was changed, had already become a symbol of Canada. It represented the land, the forests, the seasons, and the people. It was neutral, natural, something no political group could fully claim ownership of. This made the reverse of the 1964 penny both comforting and meaningful at a time when national symbols were fiercely contested. But the obverse, the side with Queen Elizabeth II, carried a different weight. Her portrait, designed by Mary Gillick, showed a young queen, crowned with a laurel wreath rather than a monarch's tiara. It was meant to symbolize grace rather than dominance, youth rather than authority. But to some Canadians in 1964, it was still a reminder that Canada had not completely separated its identity from Britain. Her face, on every coin and every note, was part of the structure Canada was questioning. Thus, the penny became a microcosm of a larger national struggle. Can a country honor its past without letting it define its future? The workers inside the mint probably sensed none of this. They handled metal, dyes, machinery, and production quotas, not political tension. Yet, unknowingly, they produced millions of coins that captured the exact moment when Canada stood between two eras. Nearly 500 million 1964 pennies were struck, and every single one emerged with that delicate balance. A monarch on one side, a natural symbol of Canada on the other. It was as though the coin itself refused to choose a side in the identity war. And the people who used the coin were the same. Canadians carried contradictions in their pockets: pride in British lineage, affection for homegrown culture, curiosity about a new national soul, and a desire to be seen as an independent country on the world stage. There was confusion, but also excitement. Canada was crafting something new, slowly, cautiously, and with occasional internal friction. In this atmosphere, the 1964 penny became symbolic not because of anything extraordinary in its metal or rarity, but because it represented a threshold. It marked the final years before Canada would adopt its new flag in 1965. The final years before bilingualism would become official policy. The final years before Quebec nationalism would erupt into new forms. The final years before coins would begin changing designs in response to new cultural currents. In retrospect, the 1964 penny is like a photograph taken right before transformation. A snapshot, frozen in copper, of the last moments of Canada's earlier identity. If you hold one today, you hold a piece of Canada's internal debate. The Queen's portrait captures the past, the colonial thread that still ran through institutions. The maple leaves capture the land, the independence, the authenticity, and the unity Canada was striving to define for itself. And this is what makes the penny such a powerful artifact. It is not simply a coin from 1964. It is Canada, suspended in bronze, at the edge of becoming something new. Collectors often talk about mint marks, compositions, striking quality, rarity, and condition. But the deeper story of a 1964 penny is not technical. It is emotional, cultural, and national. It is the story of a country caught between two symbols, one looking back, one looking forward. It is the story of identity minted in metal. And when these pennies left the mint, carried into pockets, purses, lunch counters, bus stations, farms, cities, diners, and schoolyards, they became tiny messengers of that identity. They reminded Canadians of who they had been and quietly hinted at who they were about to become. From hand to history, how a common penny became a collector's treasure. By the time a 1964 penny had passed through countless hands across Canada, it had earned a new form of immortality. Though ordinary in its day, the coin had survived decades of circulation, quietly carrying the stories of children, workers, immigrants, and families. Each scratch, dent, and faded edge was a testament to the lives it had touched. Yet, unlike many other coins, the 1964 cent journey was not destined to end in a drawer, a jar, or the melting pot. Instead, it began a transition from everyday currency to a cherished collectible, one that numismatists would one day prize for its design, history, and cultural resonance. The first stage of this transformation began naturally. Even in the 1970s, careful Canadians noticed that their older pennies carried a warmth and luster unmatched by modern coins. Some families saved rolls of pennies as keepsakes. Others discovered that a perfectly struck 1964 cent, sharp, copper red, and flawless, was an anomaly in an era of constant circulation. Collectors, both young and old, began to seek out coins with precise details. Crisp maple leaves, clearly defined lettering, and intact rims. A coin once overlooked for its small denomination became an object of scrutiny, its imperfections and perfection alike telling stories of production and handling. Numismatic interest in Canadian pennies grew throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Coin shops across Canada started cataloging mintages, die varieties, and condition grades. The 1964 penny, with its massive mintage of over 484 million, was not rare, but it became important for one reason. It represented a snapshot of Canada on the brink of transformation. Collectors understood that while the quantity was vast, the quality of individual coins varied significantly. Some had retained their brilliant copper red hue, while others had been circulated heavily, gaining patina, scratches, or discoloration. Each coin was unique, a fingerprint of its journey. Collectors quickly learned to differentiate the subtle nuances of 1964 cents. The presence of a strong strike, sharp, detailed maple leaves, and a clear queen's portrait could elevate the coin's value. Coins with full, original mint luster were highly sought after. Even slight die polishing marks or tonal variations could add intrigue, sparking debates in coin clubs and among hobbyists. Each coin was not merely copper. It was a piece of history frozen in metal, a relic of national identity, and a witness to decades of Canadian life. By the 2000s, the coin story deepened as older generations began to pass down their collections. A mother or father would retrieve a tin of pennies from the attic, showing their children coins that had once circulated in shops and markets, in banks and classrooms, over 40 years earlier. The 1964 penny became an object of teaching. It was history in your hand. Children learned not only about currency, but about social evolution, national symbols, and the small threads that connect lives across decades. Collectors in the United States and Europe also began to notice the Canadian 1-cent coins. While pennies were common in Canada, their designs and condition drew international attention. Numismatic publications highlighted the 1964 cent as part of the golden era of Canadian copper coinage. Enthusiasts shared images, auctioned coins online, and even traded them internationally. Each coin that left Canada carried with it a fragment of national identity, introducing foreign collectors to the maple leaf, the young queen, and the subtle artistry of Kruger Gray's design. The story of the 1964 penny was further amplified by the eventual discontinuation of the Canadian penny in 2012. With production halted and circulation officially ended, the coins gained new importance as relics of an extinct currency. Suddenly, even common pennies acquired historical weight. Those from 1964, once ordinary, now precious for their age, design, and connection to a pivotal era, became particularly significant. Collectors realized they were holding coins that had outlived their purpose as currency and entered the realm of memory and heritage. It is in this final stage that the 1964 penny truly shines. Imagine a collector today holding a coin struck over half a century ago. Its copper surface, though dulled slightly by age, still reflects a warm, reddish-brown glow. The portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, youthful and composed, gazes out from the obverse. The intertwined maple leaves on the reverse remind the holder of forests, landscapes, and the enduring identity of a country. Each mark, scuff, and patina tells a story of use, survival, and passage through human hands. Even as a collectible, the 1964 penny continues to inspire storytelling. Numismatists recount tales of coins discovered in forgotten piggy banks, hidden inside books, or lying unnoticed in drawers. Some coins are sold for modest sums, while others, in brilliant, uncirculated condition, fetch premium prices. Yet the real treasure is not monetary. It is historical. Each 1964 penny connects present-day collectors to Canadians who lived, worked, and dreamed decades before. Each coin bridges time, offering a tactile experience of a country in transition. In a sense, the 1964 penny became immortal. Unlike other everyday objects that fade from memory, the coin was preserved by the dual forces of circulation and collection. It experienced life in human hands, sustained by ordinary use, but survived long enough to enter the numismatic record. Its story is both ordinary and extraordinary. The ordinary life of a coin spent day after day, and the extraordinary survival of a symbol of Canada, culture, and identity. Reflections on the 1964 penny. What makes this coin exceptional is not rarity, but resonance. It was common, but deeply symbolic. It circulated through ordinary lives, yet captured extraordinary history. The 1964 penny witnessed the lives of Canadians at work, home, and play, embodied the tension between colonial heritage and national independence, reflected social, cultural, and economic currents of the era, survived decades of circulation to become a historical collectible, became a tactile link to the stories of families, children, workers, and immigrants. For a country redefining itself, the penny quietly told its story, small, unassuming, and yet endlessly enduring. Lost and found. The hidden journeys of forgotten 1964 pennies. 901,000 words. Long after the Canadian Mint had struck its final 1964 penny, and long after the excitement of a new year faded, the coins began their quiet, unpredictable migration through the country. Some traveled only a few blocks, others crossed provinces, oceans, and continents. Many lived their lives unseen, slipping into darkness inside drawers, jars, pockets, and forgotten containers. Yet each of these pennies carried a journey as rich as any person's, full of small, poetic twists of fate. Some journeys began with loss. In the autumn of 1964, on a rural road outside Saskatoon, a boy named Owen played with his friends near the edge of an open field. He kept 3 pennies in his pocket, treasures he had earned helping his father repair a tractor. One of those pennies, fresh from the mint with its bright copper glow, slipped from his pocket as he ran. It fell into the tall grass, quickly swallowed by the earth and forgotten. Seasons passed, snow piled, grass grew, and the land changed. Farmers plowed, children grew, and the world moved on. For nearly 4 decades, that single penny lay buried in silence. Then, in 2003, a metal-detecting hobbyist named Clara walked across that same field, unaware of the childhood story hidden beneath the soil. Her detector chirped softly, and she dug gently with a small spade. And there it was, a 1964 cent, aged to a dark brown patina, yet beautifully intact. She held it in her hand, brushing off the dirt with her thumb. This penny, lost by a child and found by an adult he had never met, bridged 2 lifetimes. Clara kept it in a small display box, not because it was rare, but because its rediscovery felt meaningful, almost poetic. Other pennies took longer paths. In 1966, a man named Miguel boarded a ship from Halifax, bound for Portugal to visit his aging mother. In his coat pocket sat a handful of Canadian coins, including a 1964 penny he had earned, working in a Halifax shipyard. When he reached Lisbon and emptied his pockets onto a table, the coin rolled away. His nephew picked it up, curious about the unfamiliar maple leaves. The penny stayed in Portugal, passed quietly from drawer to drawer, surviving family moves, political changes, and the passage of generations. In 2017, Miguel's great-nephew, now an adult, took the penny to a coin show in Porto, where a Canadian collector spotted it and smiled. Through luck and coincidence, the penny made its way back to Canada 51 years after it left. Some journeys were short, yet felt legendary to the people who owned them. In 1989, in the small town of Truro, Nova Scotia, a teacher named Mrs. Douglas kept a jar of pennies on her desk. Whenever a student answered a difficult question or showed kindness to a classmate, she rewarded them with a single penny from the jar. A small gesture, but one her students adored. Inside that jar were dozens of old pennies, including several from 1964. Children held them like medals, proud of their moment of recognition. Many of those students kept their pennies for life, symbols of childhood achievement, tiny reminders of encouragement that lasted decades. Some pennies were lost in the most unusual places. One 1964 penny found itself inside the mechanism of a Montreal laundromat machine sometime in the late 1970s. It slipped through a crack where coins weren't supposed to go and jammed the gears. For years, the machine hummed and clattered with the penny rattling inside it like a hidden heartbeat. When the old machine was finally dismantled in 1999, the technician found the coin wedged deep inside the mechanism. Its surface was worn smooth, but its maple leaves and date still shone clearly. The technician kept it as a souvenir, the ghost penny, he called it, the coin that lived a secret mechanical life. In British Columbia, a family renovating their 1950s-era home discovered a 1964 penny inside the wall. No one knows how it got there, perhaps dropped by an electrician, perhaps left intentionally by a child as a secret time capsule. The family placed it in a frame above their fireplace, labeling it the house penny, a reminder that homes, like people, hold stories hidden beneath their surfaces. And then there were the pennies that traveled the farthest, not across continents, but through time. In 2012, when Canada officially ended penny production, families everywhere gathered jars of old coins. Some brought them to banks, others donated them, and some kept them intentionally. Among these were thousands of 1964 pennies, rescued from drawers, rediscovered in tins, or found at the back of cupboards after years of neglect. People held them with curiosity, imagining the hands that once carried them. The coins became not just currency, but pieces of family history. Some pennies found their way to online auctions. A Canadian living in Australia bought 10 rolls of old pennies from a collector in Alberta, simply because he missed home. The 1964 pennies became a sentimental connection to the country he once walked in and the childhood he remembered. Another Canadian living in the United States bought a 1964 penny at a flea market. Not because it was valuable, but because it reminded him of his grandfather, who used to carry a handful of pennies in his pocket. And some journeys had an almost magical ending. In 2020, a little girl in Toronto named Olivia opened a tin her great-grandmother had kept for decades. Inside were sewing needles, buttons, and, at the bottom, a single coin, a 1964 penny. Old, worn, darkened with time. Her great-grandmother, now 93, explained that she had kept it because it was the first Canadian coin she received upon arriving from Italy in 1964. That penny had symbolized hope, work, home, and a new beginning. Olivia placed it inside her own small jewelry box, promising never to lose it. The 1964 penny's journeys are countless. Some are mundane, some are extraordinary, some are forgotten, some are remembered forever. But all share one truth. A small piece of copper can hold entire lifetimes, the penny in the hands of ordinary Canadians. In every corner of Canada in 1964, the small copper penny was quietly participating in lives that history books rarely mention. It didn't matter whether a person lived in Toronto's rising suburbs, on the rugged coast of Newfoundland, or in the endless wheat fields of Saskatchewan. A penny was a penny, and it was always needed except when people wished it wasn't. The 1964 Canadian 1-cent coin didn't simply exist as government-issued money. It existed as a companion to daily life, an unnoticed witness to the dreams, struggles, disappointments, and triumphs of millions. When a year began, winter still had its heavy grip on the nation. Snowbanks almost swallowed fire hydrants, frost framed every window, and children braced themselves for the cold morning walks to school. Parents slipped a few coins, including the new 1964 pennies, into their coat pockets before leaving for work. They didn't see themselves as participating in a story. Yet every time a penny moved from one hand to another, it became part of one. A little boy in Montreal could run into a small convenience store, breath steaming in the cold air, and buy a striped peppermint stick for 1 penny. The shopkeeper, a charming elderly man with glasses slipping down his nose, would drop the new 1964 penny into his cash drawer, noticing its fresh shine. For him, it wasn't just change. It was proof that Canada was producing coins that looked modern, crisp, and respectable. He had lived long enough to remember coins minted during the reign of King George V, then George VI, and now Queen Elizabeth II. He often smiled at the thought that coins keep changing, but life keeps moving forward. Down south in Ontario, a bus conductor clutched a leather coin case attached to his belt. Every day, he counted his morning float, stacks of quarters, rows of nickels, and a thick pile of copper cents. The new 1964 pennies felt different, slightly smoother, slightly more uniform. They still carried the scent of metal and the feeling of weight that Canadians are used to, but they were freshly struck, as if Ottawa had minted them just yesterday. The 1964 penny traveled, unseen but essential, from lunch counters to laundromats, from vending machines to payphones, from tiny hands of children to tired hands of parents who had worked long hours. In the rural stretches of the prairie provinces, farmers bought rope, nails, and animal feed from local general stores, paying amounts that required change down to the last cent. The new 1964 penny clinked into wooden drawers with a sound richer than its value. There was something strangely comforting about pennies in 1964. They were honest. They were simple. They did their job. They were part of the rhythm of life, a nation standing between old and new. 1964 was not just another year. It was a year filled with tension, hope, cultural change, and the growing awareness that Canada was entering a new phase of identity. And the penny, the tiny, humble copper coin, found itself minted right at the crossroads of this transformation. To understand why the 1964 Canadian cent is so historically charged, you must understand the currents stirring through the country at that specific moment. Queen Elizabeth II was still early in her reign, yet her portrait already carried a sense of stability. This was the young queen, the version of her that Canadians had embraced with pride, serene, elegant, dignified, and symbolic of continuity. But while her presence on the coin suggested steadiness, the country around her was beginning to shift. Canada was no longer the quiet dominion of decades past. It was becoming louder, bolder, more confident in its own identity. In Quebec, the quiet revolution was altering everything from education to politics. French and English Canada were discovering new ways to see themselves and each other. Old traditions were being questioned, new possibilities were being imagined. It was a time when identity was not just a topic for intellectuals. It was a conversation held in homes, schools, and workplaces. In the West, economic growth was accelerating. Oil fields in Alberta grew more vital. Vancouver began expanding into the early outlines of the multicultural metropolis it would become. Manitoba and Saskatchewan, built on agriculture, were pushing toward industrial development. Every sector of society was experiencing motion. The penny minted in 1964 unintentionally absorbed all of this tension. It was produced in massive quantity, a symbol that Canada was growing, that commerce was speeding up, that transactions were multiplying. The maple leaf design, simple yet powerful, suddenly looked like more than just an image. It looked like a declaration. We are Canada. We are something distinct. We are something becoming stronger. Even the dual maple leaves carried meaning. They weren't single, isolated, or solitary. They were paired, growing from one stem, symbolizing unity in diversity, a concept Canadians were beginning to embrace. Collectors often say that coins are snapshots of history, but the 1964 penny is something more. It is a snapshot of transition. It captures Canada in the act of becoming what it would one day be: multicultural, economically ambitious, politically confident, and culturally independent. A tiny coin, minted in copper, somehow managed to witness the turning of a national page, that a penny's private journey through a changing world. The story of a coin is never just national. It is personal. Once a penny leaves the mint, it stops belonging to the government and starts belonging to the world. It gains memories. It gains stories. It becomes part of millions of different lives, and every person who handles it adds something invisible yet meaningful to its history. Imagine a 1964 penny leaving the Royal Canadian Mint. It would have been bright, fiery in color, almost too shiny to feel real. Mint workers in white gloves examined trays of these new coins, ensuring each struck image was crisp and every edge perfectly formed. Then the coins were poured into bags, sealed, transported, sorted, counted, and distributed to banks across the country. Some pennies stayed pristine for a while, gently passed from cashier to customer without scraping against rough surfaces. Others immediately suffered the reality of circulation, clinking against heavy silver quarters, tumbling inside cash registers, and getting shoved into pockets with keys, buttons, and tiny bits of lint. But the journey of the 1964 penny was always forward, always outward, always deeper into the tapestry of Canadian life. A student in Halifax may have used it to purchase a notebook. A mechanic in Edmonton may have dropped it into a metal tin on his workbench. A mother in Winnipeg may have placed it inside a piggy bank for her child. A fisherman in Nova Scotia may have found it in his coat pocket on a cold morning before setting out into the Atlantic wind. Some pennies were treasured. Some were ignored. Some were lost. Some were saved. Some ended up in jars. Some ended up in gutters. Some ended up in collections decades later. By the time the penny reached its 20th, 30th, or 40th year in circulation, its copper had darkened. Its edges had softened. Its surface carried scratches and the scars of time. Yet it still held within it the story of Canada, a story of growth, unity, struggle, and transformation. Every mark on its surface was a footprint of a tiny chapter of someone's life. And today, in the hands of collectors, these same pennies now whisper stories. Stories of a year when Canada was changing. Stories of a coin that carried more history than anyone realized at the time. A coin that refused to be forgotten. By the time the 1964 Canadian penny began crossing into the later decades of the 20th century, it had already done more than most small objects could ever hope to do. It had traveled in pockets, in purses, in wallets, in drawers, and in dusty jars atop refrigerators. It had rolled across gas station counters, slipped between couch cushions, fallen into school lockers, and clattered into vending machines. It had lived a full life, the life of a survivor. But now, well beyond the era in which pennies ruled daily transactions, the 1964 coin entered a new phase. A phase where its story mattered more than its value, and where collectors, historians, and ordinary Canadians began to look back and realize that this tiny copper circle wasn't just money. It was a time capsule. Canada had changed. The economy had changed. Technology had changed. The nation's face had changed. But the 1964 penny remained what it always was, a quiet storyteller of a moment that would never return. Collectors began to pay attention to it not because it was rare, because it wasn't, but because it belonged to an era when Canadian identity was crystallizing, when national pride was building momentum, and when every symbol of Canada held emotional weight. A 1964 penny kept in uncirculated condition, glowing like orange fire, became more than just a coin. It became an artifact of a chapter when Canada's confidence was beginning to bloom. This last era of the penny became a long, thoughtful look backward. The rise of collectors and the search for meaning. It is one thing to use a coin. It is another to appreciate it. As the decades passed, a subtle transformation occurred. The penny shifted from money to memory. In the basements of suburban homes, small wooden boxes began appearing. Collection boxes passed from grandparents to parents to curious young children. Inside these boxes, the 1964 penny often lay, nestled between coins far older or perhaps far more valuable, but rarely more beloved. Collectors discovered that the 1964 penny was a coin of context, of emotion, of national character. Why? Because it represented the last, full, uninterrupted breath before the great transformations of the late 1960s and 1970s shook the country. The maple leaf flag would be adopted in 1965. Immigration patterns would shift dramatically. Multiculturalism would rise. French-English relations would evolve. Canadian industries would modernize. And a sense of Canadian identity would detach from British tradition more than ever. The 1964 penny belonged to that strange moment, neither past nor future, but suspended in an in-between world. Collectors loved that. They loved how the portrait of young Queen Elizabeth II carried dignity without rigidity, how the twin maple leaves represented unity through growth, how the copper material felt heavy, honest, and traditional, how the coin connected people to a simpler era. And so a penny worth 1 cent became priceless, not in the market, but in the heart. Rarity, errors, value, and the copper that changed hands. A serious collector will always ask 4 questions. 1. Is it rare? 2. Does it have errors? 3. What's the condition? 4. What is it worth? The 1964 penny's answer is unlike most coins, because although it was minted in huge quantities, over 484 million pieces, it still holds deep value, but in its own special way. Rarity. The regular 1964 penny is not rare in circulated condition, million survived, but uncirculated examples with full luster have become increasingly desirable. The copper tone, when untouched by time, glows with a color that modern pennies will never replicate. Errors and varieties. This is where collectors sharpen their attention. Some of the most sought-after 1964 Lincoln pennies include die breaks, struck through grease errors, off-center strikes, planchet flaws, double die obverse, or reverse varieties less common, but collectible when found. These error coins, especially dramatic ones, can climb significantly in value. Value, depending on condition. Circulated, 5 to 50 cents to collectors. Bright uncirculated, $3 to $15. Mint State High Grade, MS, $65 and above $20 to $100 plus. Major errors, $50 to $500 depending on type. Full red high-grade pieces, extremely desirable. The irony? Its financial value is modest. Its historical value is immense. Collectors don't treasure the 1964 penny because it is rare. They treasure it because it is representative of a nation, of a queen, of a decade, of a feeling. It is a coin whose worth is measured not by scarcity, but by significance. The final years of the penny and the end of an era. As the century turned and digital technology marched forward, Everyday Canadians slowly lost interest in the penny. Prices shifted, rounding rules were discussed, and people began to wonder how long the tiny copper coin could continue to justify its existence. Then it happened. In 2012, the Canadian government announced the end of penny production. In 2013, the penny officially stopped circulating. And just like that, a 155-year chapter of Canadian history closed. But even as the penny disappeared from everyday life, the 1964 coin survived. Not because it was needed, but because it was cherished. Many Canadians couldn't bear to part with the pennies they'd stored in jars, drawers, and boxes for decades. The 1964 penny rested in these final havens, often untouched, quietly aging into nostalgia that a grandmother might have discovered one in her old kitchen tin while preparing tea. A child might have found one buried in the backyard and run inside, shouting with excitement. A collector might have lifted one carefully under a magnifying lens, admiring the way the maple leaves still held their beauty after more than half a century. And in each case, the penny spoke without speaking. I was there. I was part of your story, part of your nation's story, and I remain a witness to all that has changed. The 1964 penny, despite being worth almost nothing in monetary terms, became priceless as a symbol of memory, a legacy that lives in human hands. In the end, the 1964 Canadian 1-cent coin is not remembered because it is rare. It is remembered because it is rooted in people, rooted in history, rooted in identity, rooted in a time when life moved at a slower pace, rooted in a Canada that was beginning to define itself. This coin belongs to the era of wool coats, train tickets, handwritten letters, and family-owned shops. It belongs to the era of early TV, wooden school desks, and the birth of Canadian independence. It belongs to a time when every penny mattered, literally and emotionally. Today, the 1964 penny continues to live. In albums, in collections, in drawers, in jars, on bookshelves, in display cases, in the hearts of those who see more than just a coin. It lives as a tiny copper testimony to the country that produced it, the hands that used it, and the stories that surround it.